My name is Paul Nunesdea. I'm a certified professional facilitator from the IAF, which stands for International Association of Facilitators. Since 2018, I've started a book series on architecting collaboration, and my latest book, in co-authorship with Martin Duffy and other renowned digital facilitators and guest co-authors, is titled Beyond Virtual Meetings. It's all about the importance of the digital tools that can extend and augment the power of you as a facilitator and a meeting host in virtual online meetings, but also on the hybrid meetings that are going to be so much needed in this post-pandemic era. Along with my co-author Martin Duffy and esteemed PhD colleague, we host Talk to Your Meeting Doctors, a series of hosted conversations with meeting experts that can advise you about how to transition to this new normal and take advantage of this incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make the organization of your meetings more sustainable and effective. Please stand by as the next show will start momentarily.
I don't regret it. I love England. I love going. I love Europe. I love going back there. I had a wonderful time in Rome in November. But I'm also happy I live in this country despite its flaws.
Yeah, it's
well,
yeah,
everywhere
we're
has
going
flaws
through
these days.
challenging times at the moment, I think, Adrian.
Yeah, let's not get started.
Yeah,
Yeah,
let's not get started. And hello, dear viewers. This is a soft starting of our third episode on 2024 Talk to Your Meeting Doctors. And as you probably know by now, we are pleased to entertain today as our guest speaker, Adrian Segar. He will be talking about his work in a few minutes, but it's great to be here with you again, Martin. Welcome.
Well, good afternoon. Yeah, thank you very much, Adrian. Lovely to meet you. And
Good to meet you. Yes.
perhaps people didn't catch it at the very start, Paul, but Adrian, you were just explaining that you're about 50 odd years in the States, having originated in the UK.
Yes, spent the first 25 years, but in my first career there, fell in love with Vermont to my complete surprise on only the second time I ever came to the United States, and then tried to figure out how to make a living in this beautiful place, which is, if many of your viewers will know, is just a stunningly beautiful rural U.S. state, and I don't regret moving here at all. It's just stunning. I look out my window. It's it's just very, very beautiful.
It's so beautiful, indeed. And Martin, we normally start our conversations with a question. I'm not sure if Adrian already watched past episodes. Maybe he's kind of prepared, maybe not. But would you like to fire it?
Yeah, and just extending from where we just started there, Adrian, we normally invite our guests, if there's something about yourself that people generally wouldn't know, any little trade secret or any little personal secret that might intrigue our listeners.
I'll say that I've been writing a weekly blog for 15 years now, and so during that time, and it's mostly about meeting design and facilitation, but I write about all kinds of things, and my bio's there, so I'm fairly transparent about my life. But I think something again that I did when I was in England or living in England, in my first career, I have, believe it or not, a PhD in high energy particle physics. I used to do research in neutrino physics at CERN. I was lucky enough to work on an incredible experiment there, maybe one of the most important high energy physics experiments in the second half of the last century. And and there are so many stories. I have one on my blog about being trapped in an elevator with a Nobel Prize winning physicist. And again, that's a long story, but it's on my blog and you can read about that. But yes, if you had told me at that time that I would be working with, what I would love to do is work with people and facilitate connection, between groups of people coming together, I would have said, I wouldn't have believed you. And I've had this long, weird kind of arc of professions and careers and life experiences that have brought me to this place, which I just really, and I'm very happy. I love doing what I do.
Fantastic. Well, that neatly actually segues us into the theme that we set for today, which is peer conferences unveiled, and the concept behind peer conferences. Can you elaborate, Adrian, and we'll let conversation take us wherever that conversation might go?
Yeah, well, maybe a tiny bit, I'll try and make this really brief. I love to talk. Of historical context, because when I was an academic, on my bio, my bio says recovering academic, but when I was an academic, I went to all these academic conferences, as a grad student and so on, with all these physicists, and I hated them because, you're in this room with 100 physicists, and it's like, these are interesting people, and and so on, and the format was all, some famous physicist. There's a lot of status about being in the front of the room and giving a speech for an hour, and maybe there'd be 5 minutes for questions at the ends, and and the questions were more about showing what a smart person who was asking the question was about actually learn. And I'm thinking, I'm in the audience, I'm thinking, there's people here, there's a guy, there are people sitting here and there. I don't know, maybe that's someone I'd really like to meet. Maybe we could work together. Maybe we could collaborate. Maybe I'd want to, or maybe I have stuff to offer them. And there's no opportunity. We spent all this time and money bringing all these people together, and nothing is going on except us listening to lectures. And of course, this was nearly 50 years ago. But it did, and the other piece of this strange obsession of mine is that I have always liked to facilitate connection between groups of people who have something in common, which is essentially what I do. And that, so I immediately, even when I was doing particle physics, I started organizing conferences. When I came to the States and started manufacturing solar systems, solar hot water systems. Again, this was long before solar electricity was viable. I organized probably the earliest solar energy conferences in the United States back in the late 70s, early 80s. But they were all traditional conferences because that's all I knew. And then essentially in 1992, I wanted to do a conference in a new area, the rise of personal computers, using them in administration, educational administration. And I thought, well, who are the experts? When you do a regular conference, well, who do you invite to speak? But there wasn't anyone to invite to speak because it was a whole new field.
So new,
So it was all new. So it's like, so how do we do this? I know there are a lot of people doing this thing, and so 3 of us invited a group together, and I invented this kind of approach on the spot. This is in 1992 for a conference where it's like, well, here we are, we're all doing this thing. We don't know each other. Pretty much don't know each other. So we have to have some way of finding out about each other, what we do, where we live, anything important, what we're working on, what our problems are, what cool things we've done that other people might want to hear about. So we did that. And then it became pretty clear, like, well, there's 3 or 4 things here we really need to talk about. And boy, there's a couple of people here who have actually done these things. So let's have them. So we created a session, we created a conference on the fly. We had no alternative because we didn't know what else to do. And then at the end of it, we essentially said, well, this has been fantastic. We created this conference. Everyone loved it because it was what the group clearly discovered it wanted to talk about, the various things. And then we had this, then it's like, so what should we do now? And that conference has now been going for 30 years, over 30 years. And
as an annual recurring
as an annual event, it's a 4-day event, and it's still defined the same way. You go there, it's a very clearly defined group of people who have something in common, and they go, and you never know what the conference program is going to be. And I developed this process. This is kind of how I got into all this. That group spends half a day learning about each other, who's there, what they want to talk about, what the resources are, generating a conference program out of that information. And then the rest of the conference, you run that program. It's very an informal program. It could be lectures, but it's very rare. The discussion, small group sessions with a lot of participation. There might be 2 or 3 people running a session because it turns out they know something about the topic. It's very informal. And then I also, over time, developed processes for figuring out, well, what have we done here? What I call a perspective, looking back into what's just happened, and giving a group and personal experiences of what that was like, and then a prospective, the future. What should we do now? Is there something? And that group, for example, over 30 years, has come up with several initiatives outside the conference. It's like, we need to do this, let's set up a task group to do this, etc., and so forth, and created whole new projects as a result. But the conference itself is different every year, and it adapts to what the people who come to it want and need, and they love it.
So who drives it, Adrian? What's the underlying driver, or is that, you mentioned the conference? Mm-hmm. Are there multiples of these different groups with different agendas or different topics of interest, or how does that work then?
So again, maybe the historical perspective is a good way to go. I started doing. I loved doing this event. People loved it. It was clearly going to continue. Other people found out about this format of what I was doing and asked me to do these conferences eventually on topics that I knew nothing about. So I thought, well, this is great, but will it work? Will this work if a group of people who own, independent garden centers in the United States get together and want to talk about stuff, or whatever it is, or people who own sports venues in the United States, association that of all the people who own sports venues in the United States. And I eventually discovered over the next 10 years that it seemed to work for everybody. Everybody loved this generalized format that I've just described, outlined to you. And that's when I decided I would write, my first book, Conferences That Work, Creating Events That People Love, to talk about that format and make it available to anyone who wanted to do it. And that book came out in 2009, and suddenly I was in the meeting industry. I mean, this was my 5th career essentially, and I had been doing these events for much longer than that, and being involved in convening events for a very long time, well over 40 years. But so the answer to your question is, I wrote a book about it, and then with a website and a blog, people started finding me and asking me to do this. And once I started doing this in the meeting industry, I was doing a huge number of events, and that gave me over time, I experimented, tried new things, new approaches, and eventually, wrote a couple more books on different aspects of how to do this work.
Super. So is there a process that, a framework or a process that you adopt generically, that probably then do you tailor that per the different particular groups that you end up working with? Is that how it operates?
Yes. I mean, again, there's so much detail. What I like to do to describe the general process is something called the conference arc. If you're creating an event that becomes the best possible event for each person who comes, that's my goal. I mean, that's the simple goal. That implies so many things. It implies that you can't have a predetermined agenda, because you don't know what these people who actually arrive at your event are actually going to want to do. You don't know what resources they have that might be amazing for other people who are there, and so on. So the framework is very simple, and I call it the conference arc. I think of any event of the kind that I do as having 3 pieces: a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in the beginning, I have a number of processes where we learn about each other. The core one is that I use a lot is called the 3 questions, where everybody at the event, and you divide into smaller groups if it's a really large event to do this, answers 3 questions to everybody in their group, maybe as many as 40 or 50 people in this opening session. And the questions are, there are no wrong answers to these questions. You can't answer these questions incorrectly. There's a fixed amount of time for each person, so we level status differences. It doesn't matter whether it's, the head of, a 50,000 person association or someone who just started working there last week. They get the same amount of time. And again, that works very well. And the 3 questions are, how did I get here? Which might be, I drove down the street, or I've been coming to this conference for years and I love it, or whatever it is. What do I want to have happen? So in other words, if this conference was amazing for me, what would I want it to look like? What would I want to be talking about? What problems do I have that I'd love to find someone to help me work on together? What things do I want to do? And I want to find other people who want to do them. And then the third question is what experiences or expertise do I have that others here might find useful? So there you get to talk about, well, I just did this cool thing last year, and this happens at almost every event where someone says something like that. We worked on this, and there's 20 people in the room are like, oh, we're just about to do that. Can you talk about? And bingo, you have a session that no one even knew was needed. That kind of stuff. So that's the beginning. The middle is the kind of bread and butter. You actually then run those sessions. And I have a whole set of fairly simple instructions for people who haven't been to these conferences before, so that they get the best out of those sessions. They're very participatory. And I have some, literally one piece of paper, double-sided piece of paper with tips for anyone who's facilitating or leading those sessions, which I find that most people with these instructions can do very well.
Yep.
And then the third part, the end of the conference arc, is a set of 2 things called, there's a personal introspective, and that's a time, an exercise where people think in the moment, what has happened for me? What do I want to change in my usually professional life as a result of being here? So while everything is fresh, the experiences are fresh, because how often do we go to a conference and go away, our heads are filled with ideas, and then, you've got to go back to work, and, you've got a million things to do, and those notes you wrote and those ideas never came to anything. So the personal introspective is an opportunity to strengthen and make it more likely that the changes you experience at the conference that you decide to make for yourself will actually happen. And the last part is this thing called esteemed. I just actually have a blog post that came out this week about the esteemed, which is where the group as a whole, the entire group, very simple process, works wonderfully well, talk individually about what their experience of the conference was. They start off with the stuff that they liked, and then they start with the stuff not that they didn't like, but they think could be improved or changed in some way. 2 separate pieces. And that does 2 things. It gives the whole group a collective experience of what the event was like. We all have our own, but you might say, I really didn't like that session. And then you hear 3 other people say, that session was fantastic for me. And that doesn't change it for you, but it gives you a feeling for why the whole community did that thing. And then the second thing is, in the process, it creates tremendous community bonding. You're saying, wow, we all just had this experience together. And out of that often comes things that the group want to do in the future. For example, for a first-time conference, people might say, we have to do this again. Let's meet next year. Okay, who wants to be in the steering? All that stuff. That's the big picture, and then there's a ton of stuff that I've developed to deal with kind of special cases because there are all kinds of processes. Those are in my second book, which is kind of like a toolkit for process design inside participant-driven and participation-rich meetings like this.
So let me step back a little bit, Adrian. From you said something about halfway through your comments there. You said there is no agenda. So it's the conference starts off with no agenda. So if there's no preordained agenda, what's the hook, or what's the reason that people show up in the first place? What are they coming?
Well, it's obviously there needs to be my sort of ikigai is a Japanese word that means, my reason for getting out of my raison d'être, reason for getting out of bed in the morning is, again, facilitating connection between groups of people who have something in common, which is basically every association, that exists on this planet, and things that we don't even call associations, because associations are actually just sort of incarnations of what one would generally call communities of practice. You have groups of people who have something in common. Every single association started with a group of people who said, we're all cardiac surgeons, or we're all, folks concerned about climate change, or whatever it is, and we want to meet and talk about that. And then the thing gets formalized, and so on. So the reality is these groups exist. There are hundreds of thousands of them all over the world. I mean, in Europe, in the United States, there are, I don't know, probably over 1 million associations alone. And there are plenty in Europe. They tend to be larger in Europe, and less of them and larger, because a lot of the things that people build associations for in the United States have handled at a governmental level in Europe and in other countries. But so the answer to your question is you define a community. There's a community of practice that's usually somewhat, there are always some vague edges, but you have a group of people, like, I did a conference for, let's say, anyone who owns an independent garden center in the United States. All those people all know each other. And there's an association for them. So they have a lot in common to talk about, and so do cardiac surgeons, and so that's how you define the group. The group kind of self-defines, and then when you frame the invitation to the conference, you have to, make it clear who you're talking about. Maybe it's a certain kind of cardiac surgeon, or people who own independent garden centers rather than large chains, for example. I mean, you define that clearly enough so it's clear when the invites go out, I'm in that group. This is interesting. I will be meeting with other cardiac surgeons or whoever the group is. That's of interest to me. And when you tell them that it's a format where you will actually get to ask questions and get problems solved about that you personally have, that the conference is designed to work that way, and who knows, the conference may well even tap your valuable knowledge and experience and expertise that you don't even necessarily know is valuable until 20 other people say, wow, that's really a cool thing you've done. We want to hear about it. We want to learn from you. All those things become possible in these events.
So once we've set a thematic area, we haven't set an agenda, but we've set a thematic area. We've identified a target audience. We've pushed out the invites. We've set the date. We've got the venue. People rock up, and now what happens? And let me be a bit more specific, actually. So very often there's going to be somebody is going to cheerlead from their perspective, and they're not always necessarily the best people to hold a group together, but they'll almost always want to take the lead. Is that what happens, or is it more structured and more managed than that?
The subtlety of designing meetings like this is that you need people who I would call facilitators. I sort of define myself as a meeting designer and facilitator. So clients will often ask me to facilitate the meeting. And again, it's a meeting usually about something I know nothing about. I'm very curious and I'm always interested and I learn a lot. But these are very different. I mean, for example, Eric de Groot, who you mentioned earlier, he'll do corporate events. Okay, you've got situations where two companies are merging or something like that. How do we make that happen successfully and so forth? and he's brilliant at that. He has he's very, very good at that. My work is much more. My focus is much more on a good experience for each person who's there.
It's interesting. It's fascinating, the world of meetings, and
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
fascinating. Because now we see like kind of a specialization. Eric is more focused on corporate meetings, and
Yeah.
Adrian's more association meetings. It's
Yeah.
interesting.
But Eric said there, his focus is on personal experience as opposed to, let's say, corporate experience, which that's an area that I'd be kind of intrigued to understand in a little bit more detail as well from him.
Absolutely, absolutely. But what crossed my mind, Martin, is that in the world of corporate meetings, every
Yeah.
one of us is also a professional from an association, likely. So we are kind of, if we are not in a corporate meeting, we will probably end up in an association meeting. So it's so. Thank you so much for watching us, dear viewers. We are on episode 3 of Talk to Your Meeting Doctors. This is a LinkedIn Live event series co-hosted by me and my dear colleague Martin Duffy. Today we have as a special guest Adrian Segar from the United States, and we are having a wonderful conversation. Martin, can you just bring us back to the thread?
Sure. Yeah. I'll do a really quick synopsis to bring us forward. Adrian, you started off telling us your first career in particle physics brought you along to academic conferences, which you found a little bit stifling of participation. And you found a way for new people coming together in groups to engage hearts and minds in a way that was based on a beginning, middle, and end to the conference. Your beginning has 3 key questions that enable people to engage and interact with each other at the interpersonal level. And out of that flows the common interests that they have in whatever the thematic area of the conference is. The middle part of your session is then to run the discussions using facilitators within the groups themselves, and you've got guidelines and so on for that. And then at the end of the conference, you said to us that there are 2 different endings that you try to focus on. One is the personal kind of perspective. So what did people introspectively take or get from the conference? And they do that at the very end rather than 3 days later when a lot of it might have gone out of their heads. And the second thing then is to look at the collective perspective. So it's a kind of a feedback within the group about the conference itself. What was good and what wasn't necessarily so good that we might improve the next time. Interestingly, then, you took us from framing the invitation to the event, which now takes us into particular groups with particular individuals in the group where there's a thematic area, and then your focus is typically on the personal experience that people get from the conference that they're attending. And that's where, unfortunately, the technology let us down. We had to pause and we're back to continue. So looking at it from the personal experience point of view, as opposed to your colleague, Eric de Groot, where you suggested Eric will be more focusing on the corporate perspective. Your perspective is at the personal experience level. Could you expand that idea just a little bit for us, Adrian, to give us a flavor of what you have in mind with that?
Yes. Again, going back to my joy at bringing people together at an individual level in ways that work for them. I don't determine what those ways are. I give them the support and structure for them to create the connections and the sessions that they need, and give them good process to allow them to run those sessions.
Yeah.
I will add in the beginning piece, after that uncovering of who's there, what they want to talk about, and what the resources are in the room. The saying, the smartest person in the room is the room.
Yeah.
We've uncovered the whole room. I have a whole bunch of ways to take that information, which in many cases is being scribed, collected for all the participants to be able to refer to, and turn that into a conference program. There's an art in doing that, you know, in taking what you hear, and I use all kinds of techniques. Many of which are described in my second and third books. The third book is basically about that whole process. Event crowdsourcing. It's about how do you create an event that zeroes in on what are the methods you need to do to take all this information, first of all, to uncover it, and then take it and create an event that's maximally useful for the people who are there.
Yeah.
So again, my perspective is Eric will get a client who says, this is what we want to achieve for this organization. Usually it could be an association.
Yeah.
And he will come up with some very creative ways outside the box, using these elementary meeting techniques, which he's really great at. He's a very creative guy on coming up with, to create a meeting that serves the needs primarily of people at a higher level, in a way that works for the whole organization. Whereas my focus is kind of from underneath. My focus is I'm interested in every single individual person who comes. Well, how can I make their experience, the utility of that event, maximally useful for them? And what I found, and I've been doing this for a long time now, decades, is that when you do that, the group as itself benefits. The stakeholders, the sponsors, the folks who brought the event together, maybe the leaders of the association, are very happy because the event is very energetic. People are very happy with it. And it also, at the end, in that last session, often comes up with whole new directions for the group to go that are from the bottom up. They're not imposed by some leadership at the top, but the people in the group, the people who form it, that community of practice is saying, hey, this is what we want to explore. This is where we want to go. And those initiatives are very likely to be successful, much more successful in general than the sort of top-down directive of people at the top saying, we think we should go here. And their intentions may be great, but in fact, they don't necessarily, as we all know, that doesn't always pan out that well.
Absolutely. So what kind of time scale for that type of conference then? Is there a typical time scale over which a conference like this would run?
That is a wonderful question. And again, that's part of the art of designing a meeting. Yeah. That conference has been going on for 32 years now. That's a 4-day conference. So you have plenty of time to do all kinds of stuff. You know, it starts up with a half day and then there's 3 full days after that. But sometimes people don't have, you know, that's actually a rarity these days.
Yeah.
I can do something useful in any amount of time. I mean, the popularity of probably the most well-known format in this genre, which is open space technology, which most people know, you can run an open space technology thing in 2 hours, you know.
Yes,
but there's no, and I've written some critiques of open space, and some people think that what I do is, it's got to be open space. So open space is just one of many formats.
Yeah.
It has a number of advantages, one that it's fairly well known. It has some disadvantages too, in that it tends to, in my experience, cater to extroverts who are happy to come up at the start of the thing and say, I'm going to do a session on this in room so-and-so. And it's true that, you know, people don't have to go to it, but there's some time wasted there. And, you know, it's inefficient because you go there, it's like, this isn't really what I wanted. Well, you can leave, the law of 2 feet.
Yeah.
And so on. I believe if you've got the time, so if you have half a day or a day and a half or 2 days, it's worth doing this beginning piece that I described to you in general terms,
yeah,
where you take some time to find out what everybody is interested in, not just the people who are like, I want to do a session on this, or I want to, which is great, nothing wrong with that, but the introvert who actually is a fount of knowledge on a topic, but isn't likely to stick their hand up and say, I want to run a session, gets lost in that. you don't hear from those people. I've talked to people running open space who have said, I know that there was the world expert on this topic, in this area in the room, and they never offered a session because that's just not the kind of person they are. That person would be far more likely for in the processes that I use to be unseen, acknowledged, and people would say, we really want to hear from you, on X, that you know a lot about. And that person is much more likely to take part in the event.
Yeah. I was going to specifically ask you about open space because I've run a number of open space events myself. And some of the things you were describing are very similar to open space, but actually some of the things you're describing are quite different to open space. So would you characterize open space as a variation of peer conferences, or would you describe it more as a separate type of format in its own right?
No, I think it's definitely a participant-driven, participation-rich format, and that's kind of how I describe the peer conferences that I run. But I've run open space when time is really limited. If you've got 2 hours and you've got a group together, and it's like, well, what do we want? What do we want to do in 2 hours? Yeah. Open space is probably about the only reasonable format you can use. I believe, from my long experience, that if you have more time, it is well worth spending a certain amount of time. And again, the amount of time it takes. You don't have to take a half a day to learn what's going on. That a half a day is plenty of time for everybody in a group to learn, to get a really good picture about who's there, what they want to talk about, and what resources are in the room. But you can do that in a much shorter period of time at a shorter event. So part of the art of doing this is from my experience, people say, well, I have a day and a half. Clients come to you and say, I have a day and a half. What should I do with it? And I can say, we should spend this much time on this much time on this much time on this. Maybe there's not enough time for a personal introspective because it's a short event. We'll just have that spective at the end. So that's the benefit of using someone like me, because I've done so many of these things and knowing what you do with the time. Yeah. And there are certain situations where you do something where your client, I did a conference in Philadelphia last summer where the client wanted to start off, it was a association, a 50-year anniversary of a US association, and they wanted to talk about the future. It was the first time they'd ever had a conference, and they wanted to have it. They had already invited, when they brought me in, an expert about talking about forecasting the future, and then they had a panel with their experts with that person, and then they brought me in at that point to open up the event and say, well, what do we want to talk? Having heard all this, these really good ideas and thoughts about the future, what do people now actually want to talk about? I used a very different technique at that point because a lot of information had already been uncovered. We had only had a limited amount of time and so on.
Yeah.
The other thing that I will mention that I can do, that I really love to do, is, and that I kind of specialize in, is taking a large group of people with a significant problem that's group-wide and facilitating a very large group discussion for solutions on that problem. And I have a technique called the fishbowl sandwich, which I developed out of need, which works incredibly well and brings up all kinds. It's basically tapping the wisdom of the group for ideas, and people who, again, don't even know that they have a fantastic solution that half the people in the room, I mean, I've experienced this numerous times. Someone comes up on stage and says, well, I don't really have this problem because I do X.
Yeah.
And half the room goes, oh, that's brilliant. And the magazine editor for the association, journal comes up and says, can I interview you about, I mean, it's just incredible. And this person was just someone sitting in the audience who's like, well, I don't have this problem. And then but then the process brings them up on stage and they share, and it transforms the group, and you find 3 other people who have fantastic ideas, and it's a very valuable session for dealing with large group problems that everybody has.
Yeah. When you say large group, Adrian, what scale are we talking about?
Good question. You can do what I just described with hundreds of people, and there's a whole issue about how some of the things I do scale, and how you scale things, because as we all know, a meeting with 50 people, when facilitated right, is very different from, in the same amount of time, 1,000 people. There you have to do different things. Typically, though, the best events are relatively small, up to hundreds of people, because there's no way you can facilitate really effective connection between 500 people in a day. You can't. I can do that better than a traditional conference can, but you're not going to meet all other 499 people and get to know them in a day. It's impossible. Human beings don't work that way. Yeah.
Really interesting. The fishbowl sandwich. Just the name is intriguing. What is there a trade secret behind that we
No,
can't
I write about these things. One of the things, well, one of my mentors, Jerry Weinberg, said a long time ago is don't have any secrets. Basically, share with your clients. I found this worked out very well. So fishbowl sandwich, it's described in my second book in detail. It's a very simple technique. It starts off with pair share in the audience. So basically you have, when I use it for problem solving in large groups, what you do is this. You have so you state the problem. You might have 3 people who have some ideas on how to solve the problem come up before the group and give a absolute max 5-minute description of how they are approaching this problem. So that kind of primes the audience to think about creative ways. Then you do a pair share where you just get everyone in the audience is in pairs, and each person talks about their personal experience of that problem, and and how they're dealing with it. If they have some way of dealing with it, maybe they're puzzled with one other person, and then so that's a standard pair share, standard facilitation technique. But that gets everybody open. Everyone in the room then has said something to someone else in the room, and that opens up. And if someone says, I did this, and the other person says, wow, that's really cool, maybe you should say something, in the main part of the session, because I think other people would be interested. So you've primed everyone. And then I run a fishbowl. You all know what a fishbowl is, well, there are several kinds. But basically, I have a stage, you have the front of the room, I'm in a chair, there are 4 other chairs. And the fishbowl, for those of you who don't know what that is a wonderful technique for working with large groups of people and controlling conversations. The rules are very simple. You can only speak if you're sitting in one of these chairs in the front of the room. So I'm sure, Paul, you know this, Martin, maybe you know this too. And you invite people up to speak. So you say, okay, we've heard some things, you've had some discussions. I'd like to hear people who want to talk about their particular problem, or maybe you've got a great way of solving it and so on. Come up here and sit in the chair. If you want to say something, come and sit in the chair. People come and sit in the chairs. I have the mic, maybe a few mics. I facilitate a conversation between those people. The other rule of fishbowl is when you finish what you have to say, you leave a chair. And another rule is if all the chairs are full and people are sitting up there, and someone else comes up, then someone in one of the chairs has to leave. So you have a conversation with a facilitator and a maximum of maybe 4 other people at any one time. Sometimes I'll facilitate those 2 people are talking amongst each other. Sometimes it's individual statements and so on. And it's very dynamic. Anyone from the audience can come up. And then the last part of the sandwich, it's called a fishbowl sandwich because it's a fishbowl sandwiched with a pair share at the beginning and a pair share at the end. Okay. The final pair share is lessons learned. What did I learn today? And you do that with someone else in the audience, and you say, wow, that idea was really a great idea. I'm going to do that, when my business or my group, when I get home, and so on. And again, that's a cementing technique. Like the perspective or the personal introspective I mentioned earlier, pair shares are very good at reinforcing change. because the other fundamental thing about the conferences I do is that I'm always interested in creating change in people's lives that work for them. And if you go to a conference and you have a good time, but nothing ever changes in your life, I would argue there wasn't much point in going, or wasn't any point in going. I mean, apart from having a nice time, but I don't have to go to a conference to have a nice time. You know, I want to learn stuff. I want to get new ideas. I want to maybe change my life. I find a new someone who can offer me a new job or a new position or a new way of thinking about things.
The really interesting that I'm picking up thematically, that I'm picking up from each of the points that you're elaborating for us, is this idea of personal experience. So, you know, the idea of using the pairing discussion, where that's opening up, creating the kind of the unbounded part of the conversation, but even still with the fishbowl part, we still have 4 people having conversation at an intimate level. And then the pair share at the end is consolidating the takeaways, and it's people repersonalizing. So that seems to be a fundamental theme that I can feel threading through everything that you're describing there, which is really fantastic.
Right.
In terms of scale, you know, where you run an event that's, say, between 50 and 100 people, can you give us a sense of how you manage to bring that personal into that scale of collective? How does that mechanically work in your events?
Well, the whole event design is designed to model and support personal interaction through, not pointless stuff like, icebreakers and stuff like that, which I think, are terrible things. Yeah. A lot of people think, oh, we're going to do that. No, the crucial thing is, and that's why the 3 questions that I talk about are so important. They get to the heart of what it is people want to know about each other at an event. When I was that grad student sitting in an academic conference, I wanted to know why that person 3 chairs away from me, I wanted to know what they did, why they were at this conference. I wanted to know what they were working on. I wanted to know what they knew about. And then that's all the information you need to have a conversation with those people. So when you design these aspects, the wonderful thing I've learned, because I've done a huge amount of group work in my life, is that you can gently, and hopefully ethically take people to places that they would never go by themselves. Yeah. We all know this, I think, and that's one of the things I love about group work. And I love taking people into this framework process, these processes, and they suddenly discover that they're talking with their peers in a way that is a way that they love. It's like, wow, I went to this session, I saw that there are 3 people here I really want to talk to, and then I can get to go and talk to them, maybe in a session, maybe out in the hallway. And I found that out on the first half day or the first few hours of the event. And even if nothing else happens at the event, the fact that that session introduced me to those people is incalculable. Maybe it changed my life, or their lives. So you build all these interpersonal stuff, the support and the norm that it's okay to communicate and talk to people. You give them a framework to do it in that's not threatening, that's safe, and then you sit back and let them do it. I mean, you watch it and you make sure it's going according to plan, but they do all the work.
Yes,
that's what facilitation really, for me, is about. You intervene, and if your design is good, you don't need to intervene very much.
Absolutely.
And when you bracket it then at the back end, very early in our conversation, you mentioned the idea of closing out, and you have the 2 steps to closing out, which is the personal introspective, and then there's the prospective piece. The
prospective piece.
Yeah,
it's a combination of a retrospective, looking back, and a prospective, which is looking forward, and I call them spective because it's both.
Okay, so the future-looking spective that you operate, how does that work just in practice? What does that sound like or feel like in the group?
Well, so I usually use, in terms of the process I use for that, I usually use I usually use a pair share or trio share to get people going. So people might talk to each other and say, yeah, this is what I really liked about the event. And so they are already, everybody in the room is already thinking about what I look like. And then I use a very simple technique called plus delta, which is, but it works really well. You do it with a flip chart, or you can do it with a Google Doc. I do have, and I have two mics, a plus mic and a delta mic. And I have people come up and I just say, okay, if there's something you liked about this event that you want to share, come up to the mic, the plus mic, and people form a line, be brief. This is what I liked, the session, the food, whatever, meeting this person, whatever it is. You get a stream of those. And I keep inviting the audience up. And you can do this with hundreds of people. And it can still, half an hour, sometimes less. You can get this very good information about what was great about the event. And sometimes I have clients video these things because they turn into amazing testimonials. It's like, someone say, this was so great, and so on. So there's the plus mic, and then eventually the pluses peter out, and then I open up the delta mic and I explain, this is not about bad stuff. This is about how you would change, what would you change to make this event even better? And people come up there. I think we should do more of this. That session could be improved by blah, blah, blah. And I have two mics because it's very possible someone will come up to a delta mic and say, I think we shouldn't do this anymore. And someone else in the audience will say, actually, I thought that was really good. They'll come up to the plus mic. So you're hearing some. So anyway, but that's plus delta. Very, very good technique and I usually have, the client will usually have people recording what people have said, because that's incredibly valuable information for the stakeholders to maybe improve the event, for next time. And sometimes the plus delta, and this is also client specific. Occasionally clients will ask me to deal with an issue that has been troubling the association, that comes up during the plus delta. You can hear it, it's obvious, often pretty obvious. And after that, I will often facilitate a discussion, which might be kind of like a fishbowl sandwich or whatever, on a specific issue. Or we might hear an overwhelming desire, the plus delta, which I feel compelled to say, okay, guys, I think we should spend a few minutes figuring out this. It's very clear that this group wants to do X. Let's just have a few minutes to facilitate a discussion on how that's going to happen right now while it's really fresh in our minds. And that's why the group perspective, that last session, I usually budget it for maybe an hour, and it's often less than that. But that hour allows us time in case some issue comes up that needs individual attention.
Super. Yeah, I've used a technique I call it PMI, plus minus interesting, and it was developed by Edward de Bono.
Yes.
Very similar principle.
Yes.
The interesting it's not a plus and it's not a minus. It's whatever people found interesting, but it's the same concept of delta, where we find the difference in perspectives, and then we can actually lever off that to say, well, where would you take this conference next, or the next conference, where would you take it differently, which is really. Paul, I'm watching the time there. Are we at our limit at this point?
We are at our limit, but still I have a last question to ask to Adrian, if I may, Martin, and then over to you to the wrap up, because it's a privilege to have here Adrian Segar, the mind beyond the peer conference model, should we say, instead of even more than a method, it's a model to design, create your own conferences. And Adrian, I've learned so much in these last few minutes with you, and also the comparison you had with open space technology. It's really interesting, because it never struck me that how important it can be to have the group to melt before they actually start working. And I think that's precisely what you accomplish with your peer conference model, is that melting at the start that will make people to join a safety zone where they then will be able to learn from each other. That's amazing. And definitely, question to you, though, is that in the meeting industry, as you rightly said that you're positioning yourself in the meeting industry, there's still these traditional conferences that attract people by the thousands and extremely expensive. I normally compare them to people in a library buying a book, right? Because this is preset content that you want to acquire when you buy that book. So you go into that conference, you pay the ticket to get that content, right? But in the end, it's always back to the principle of you leaving that conference, maybe with some wonderful experience, but with little change on yourself. So how do you convince meeting owners, the people who organize these large events, that, a peer conference model is more sustainable, more effective? How do you convince them?
Well, there's no one answer to this. My rule of thumb, and I think Eric has said the same thing to me, my rule of thumb is if I can actually get to talk to the decision makers at the organization I work with for 10 minutes, the CEO, let's say, I can convince pretty much anyone. And this tragedy is very often that middle management or upper management will contact me and say, hey, I love what I read about your stuff, or I heard about it, or a colleague of mine experienced it, and we want to do this. And it's not unusual for the CEO to be inaccessible to me and say, well, can I talk to your decision maker about this? Because I can convince most people, in my experience, if I can talk to them directly. And sometimes that's impossible. Sometimes at these larger organizations, this person, you can never speak to them. And I have to say that when I don't, it's rare for this approach to be adopted. We still, so many associations, organizations are still stuck in these hierarchical models that I don't really reflect, I think, reflect a really effective environment for creating change and fulfilling the needs for which the organization is created. We still have a lot of top-down stuff. So the answer to your question is, I get frustrated with it too. I mean, it's not like I get to work with a client. A client approaches me and then they hire me. I mean, as a consultant, you need to be prepared for people to reject your advice. You have no influence, only authority. The plus side of all this is that I love the clients that I get to work with. I mean, because they get, or at least partially get, enough to trust what I do to actually experience it. And when they do, typically they will adopt how I have designed their meetings. I influence them, and their future meetings, even if they don't use me anymore, are different. And again, I enjoy the actual experience of, I love running in-person meetings. I do it online as well, obviously, and design online meetings as well. Spend a lot of time since COVID figuring out how to do what I did or do in person online. But it's a perpetual struggle to change. And I've written extensively about this in my books. Why, and I think Eric talked about it too, we're all indoctrinated in school to sit there, and the model that every single one of us still gets is like, there's a person in the room who talks to you for 15, 20 years, whatever, who knows more than you do. Yeah. And that is how you get taught. And so, that's how I was taught. And for years, that's when I was a college teacher at one point, I taught the same way too. I didn't know any better. But my sort of vocation and desire is to spread the way I've described to you today, to create meetings because when I would say it's 90, in the very high 90s of people who go to these meetings, the most common response is, I don't want to go to a regular meeting anymore. That was just fantastic. And that's growing. And we do see that, luckily, in the meeting industry. When I started, people were still doing totally conventional events, and open space was this weird fringe thing. And now people in the meeting magazines talk about the importance of connection at conferences rather than just content, and how we create that. They still don't, most people still don't know how to do it well, but at least we're moving in the right direction, and that's all we can do.
Absolutely. And for you, dear viewers watching us, if you want to plan a meeting, please contact Adrian Segar. There's a wealth of resources in his website, conferences that work. Myself, I'm a user because I also use Adrian's stuff when I prepare some of my meetings. And it's definitely well worth to read and access those materials. And Martin, this reminds me that the more association meetings we have that are peer-based, peer model conferences, maybe that kind of energy that you get in this association meetings, once you get back in your corporate environment, in your organization, then you say, oh my God, this meeting sucks, right? Yeah. And probably is going to force in corporate meetings to be more effective as well. Martin, I think we are close to the time. Over to you to wrap up. And
yeah, there's one. I did a small summary because of our technical glitch in the middle there. But actually, just in the last 15 minutes, Adrian, there's one really significant takeaway that I'm getting from what you've said. And it was a throwaway comment you made, but you talked about bottom up versus top down. And when we compare and contrast what Eric talked to us on our last episode about, would be more reflective of a top down corporate type approach, which is fine, no judgment made on that.
Sure.
But how you describe your approach is very much a bottom up. And from my own experience, what I might suggest is that the fear of the peer conference approach might just be a fear that if the bottom up is going to send us in a different direction to where the top down thinks we should be going, are we afraid that we won't be able to handle the shift required? Or do we embrace the possibility that by adopting a bottom up shift, we can all actually head in a much more unified and harmonious and productive direction? So I think there's a fascinating, the concept of peer conference, as you've so generously shared with us, Adrian. I think it really does open the possibility of that bottom up input to the overall future direction that our group or our collective or our association, our organizations, whatever they may be, that bottom up input, there's a ready-made way in which we can get that. The question is, are we brave enough to try it?
I think that's an excellent point, and I agree that a lot of the difficulty in introducing these kinds of meetings to replace or improve on existing meetings is the fear of something unknown and something that one doesn't have control over. In a hierarchical organization, people are like, well, we know where we're going. There are people who are leading us, and so forth. The thing that actually happens, and I don't think this has ever not happened, is that the folks at the top discover that these events are incredibly useful for everybody, including them, and the participants, the folks who are not at the top, really appreciate the leadership for giving them these opportunities, and are very grateful. And again, my experience is create a stronger organization. So it's win-win for everybody. The leaders actually get really good feedback from these events, and are also really appreciated. Yeah. And the people in the organization or the association are grateful to them. It's like, thank you for making this event much better than the traditional event maybe we used to have or I've gone to all my life, and so on. So there is no downside, but you're right. There's fear, and change. Change is scary. I've written a lot on my blog about facilitating change, the difficulties of doing that, how to do that, leadership models. There's all kinds of stuff there.
Yeah.
And I do want to mention actually that it is the most popular website on meeting design and facilitation in the world. I think about nearly 6 million page views last year. So
Wow.
it's a pretty popular website.
Yeah.
And there's tons, over 800 blog posts on it, conferencesthatwork.com. It's a great resource, and you could read everything for free. And, and then again, I have, these books. If you want some books as well, that really go into all these things we've talked about today in a lot more detail.
Super.
In terms of
Fantastic.
why you should do them and how to do them. Really practical stuff.
We are on a mission here, Adrian, and thanks for joining our list of guests here and Talk to Your Meeting Doctors. We are on a mission here to convert the meetings of the world in much better meetings.
Better ways. I agree with you. I'm with you 100%. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I love talking about it. I appreciate the opportunity, and it's great to meet the two of you and have some, find some more allies in this journey we're on.
Definitely.
Real pleasure meeting you, Adrian. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Bye now.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, what a fantastic conversation with Adrian. It's and on his final point there, Paul, he raised an interesting challenge, and a challenge that Eric de Groot raised with us actually in our first episode, and that's the challenge of convincing the powers that be within organizations that there may be a different way and a better way to manage their resource of meetings in its totality. So not just the special meetings or the special conferences, but equally their day-to-day meetings. So perhaps we could line something up for a future episode on that.
Absolutely, Martin. And this is what we discussed in the past when we did a review of 2023 episode. Coaching, executive coaching is really an important part of group facilitation in the end.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And perhaps that could be an interesting topic for the next episode, and we're inviting some executive coaches also to be in this conversation. And definitely access to top decision makers is important, because as Adrian just said, sometimes he's prevented to discuss his ideas with top decision makers. But definitely it's going to be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, let's look forward to that one, and hopefully everybody will tune in for our next episode.
And thank you so much, dear viewers, for watching us today. We had the privilege to add Adrian Segar, the pioneering mind behind peer conferences. Thanks so much for watching us.
Thanks, everyone.